Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're watching us from. On behalf of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, it gives me a great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, chair, fellow scholars, and participants who have joined us through Zoom and are watching us live on our YouTube channel. We are very thrilled to have you join us this morning at the International Young Scholars Summit 2020. This international forum aims to bring together rigorous and erudite young scholars from all around the world to over a very single platform. The aim is to create an academic space to encourage young scholars and academicians from the field of international relations, political science, diplomacy, public policy, and administration, and related subfields. The conference will be held for 3 days consecutively and throughout 30 different sessions, with 2 parallel sessions, white and green rooms, running simultaneously throughout the conference. The conference will be held and will feature 275 scholars from 25 different countries who will be delivering their presentation and sharing their understanding with us. The session is also streaming live on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to share it on your social media handle with the hashtag IYSS2020. This is the first session of the conference, and to chair and moderate the session, it is a real pleasure to have Dr. Pramod Jaiswal here with us today. Dr. Pramod Jaiswal is a research director at Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. He has been a regular and visiting faculty at different universities, such as Tribhuvan University and Pokharel University of Nepal, and China Foreign Affairs University, Fudan University, and Tongji University of China. Previously, he has worked with Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, and also as a daily correspondent at Rising Nepal. He is a member of several academic committees and editorial board of several journals. He holds master's, MPhil, and PhD from the School of International Studies, GNU. He has also authored and edited and co-edited around a dozen of books on international affairs. So without any further ado, now let me welcome Dr. Jaiswal to moderate and introduce the speakers for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumnima, for the kind introduction. Mr. Giriraj Pokharel, Honourable Minister of Education, Science and Technology, Nepal. Professor Anuradha Chenoy, former Dean, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Ms. Bandana Rana, Vice Chair, UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Ambassador Gyan Chandra Acharya, former Foreign Secretary of Nepal and UN Under Secretary General and High Representative of LDC. Professor Amitabh, Mattoo, Professor Jawaharlal Nehru University and Honorary Professor, University of Melbourne. Participants from diplomatic community, academicians, experts, friends from media, and dear participants. Namaste and good morning. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all at the International Young Scholars Summit 2020. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. NIICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Defense and Security Studies. We also have 8 major research topics: global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, climate change and energy, disaster management, international economy and development, Belt and Road Initiative of China, Indo-Pacific affairs, refugee and migration, border and transboundary water politics. In last 4 months, we have published 180 articles. Most of them are India and China. We have organized 73 events where we invited around 700 scholars to talk on issues of contemporary issues. We have invited leaders like former Nepalese Prime Minister Madhav Nepal, incumbent Foreign Minister of Nepal, Pradeep Gewali, former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of New Zealand, Sir Donald Charles McKinnon, incumbent State Minister of Education of Maldives, and several others. Some of the greatest thinkers like Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor John Mayer Scheimer, great diplomats and foreign secretaries of India, Sri Lanka, and many others has also been invited by NIICE. We have also organized joint webinars with great institutions like Institute of South Asian Studies, National Institute of Singapore, Center for South Asian Studies, Fudan University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and several others. Ladies and gentlemen, this webinar of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is being hosted for 3 days, where more than 275 young scholars from 25 countries are taking part. There are 30 sessions. Since it is an academic conference, we have not followed any order or protocol. Rather, to encourage the young scholars, we have asked some of them to chair a few sessions and present the papers. There is 60% women participation in this conference. Last month, we also organized an international conference with 150 senior scholars from different parts of the world, which was inaugurated by Honourable Foreign Minister of Nepal. Ladies and gentlemen, we feel that there is a need to encourage young scholar and emerging scholar to write and engage in academic activities. I'm sure this webinar will not only encourage them to take part in academic activities, but will also get an opportunity to learn and connect themselves with young scholars around the world. We have limited participants from Nepal, as international relations as a discipline is recent and evolving in the country. We hope we have greater participation in days to come. I would like to welcome our distinguished guest scholar participants at the inaugural session of the conference and thank them for their presence. In order to give an inaugural remark, I would like to invite Honourable Minister of Education, Science and Technology, Mr. Giriraj Pokharel, to deliver his remarks. We are really thankful to Minister for his valuable time. Minister Pokharel has always been kind and supported us in every form at every point of time. Honourable Minister needs no introduction. He is a Minister of Education, Science and Technology. He has served as Minister of Health and Population twice. He is a standing committee member of Nepal Communist Party. Honourable Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Professors, Excellencies, eminent scholars, distinguished participants, friends from media, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning and namaskar. I greet you at a time when we all are affected by a global pandemic that is impacting the way we live and function around the world. I wish for good health of everyone. Allow me to firstly express my profound gratitude at being offered this opportunity to grace this event. I would like to congratulate Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and its director, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for organizing International Young Scholars Summit 2020. I am encouraged by seeing a group of young, fine scholars participating from the region and beyond. I am told that there are more than 275 scholars from 25 countries participating at this 3-day webinar. I am really impressed looking at the range of young scholars from around the globe taking part at this conference. The post-COVID-19 world belongs to the youth. They are the one who will shape the world of tomorrow with their vision and strength. They will define the new world order. The 3-day online conference with 275 scholars from 25 countries would be reflecting on what the future would look like and discuss the contemporary issues of the world. I wish them best luck, and I believe that we can immensely benefit from their scholarly presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, as we navigate through this crisis to the best of our abilities, it is difficult throughout the globe. The deadly virus has brought the entire world community to a standstill. We do not know how long the crisis will last, nor do we know how this pandemic will end. We are seeing some rays of hope on the horizon through recent news of progress in the research and development of the vaccines. The pandemic has put the government across the world under tremendous strain. The impact has already started to surface in a number of sectors like tourism, trade and supply, production, health, and education. Having said that, let me make a brief remark on COVID-19 and its impact on education. The pandemic has significantly disrupted every aspect of human life, including education. The alarming spread of the virus caused a disorder in the educational system, forcing educational institutions to shut down, as children and senior citizens are most prone to the infection. Millions of children around the world are bound to stay at home. According to a UNESCO report, 1.6 billion children across 191 countries have been severely impacted by the temporary closure of the education institutions. Therefore, the challenge of learning during the COVID-19 pandemic remains enormous. However, the government around the world are trying to find new ways to deal with this crisis. Every country is working to introduce new modes of learning. Tele-education, radio learning, online learning, and many other methods are being adopted to reach to the students and to prepare for emergencies and to make the system more resilient. I believe every crisis gives an opportunity which, if acknowledged properly, will shape the change for betterment and greater overall benefits of humanity post-crisis. At this point, please allow me to point out some notable steps that have been taken in the sector of education, science, and technology by the Ministry of Education, Science, and Technology in Nepal. Within a gap of few months, last year, new National Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy and National Education Policy were endorsed by the Cabinet. Fortunately, pre-COVID, new policy implementation had started in Nepal. Especially in science and technology sector, during the crisis, I have been overwhelmed by the efforts of youth scientists and innovators in Nepal. With limited resources, the mobilization and upcoming of this community has been the silver lining amidst the pandemic for me. In lieu to STI policy of late, our focus is in creating a conducive environment so as to foster the young, innovative and scientific talents in Nepal, which I believe will be a major force in realization of our national goal of prosperous Nepal and happy Nepali. Regarding the education sector, we have recently declared that we will be completing the current academic calendar using alternative education pedagogy, a guideline with clear roadmap on how to implement up to high school level education has been recently endorsed by the Cabinet. Universities have already started to trace the outbound students. Most of the universities have started their academic session, with few even have completed examinations online. In Nepal, we have long practicing the distance education mode in school education at a small magnitude, but current crisis has demanded for a much more elaborative approach. Keeping in mind the digital divide and other factors, we have adopted home school as a means to education for all, a blend approach of handing over to students the self-learning print materials and textbooks, FM and radio, television and cable, and online classes has been identified as the medium to deliver academic contents to the students. Teachers are instructed to reach out to their students through telephones and other available means so as to aid their learning. School curriculum has been condensed to secure minimum learning of students, with local government in the front seat during implementation. All three forms of government mandated with their respective roles to oversee the proceedings at school level. I am confident that with support from all the stakeholders, we will be able to complete this year's academic calendar, leaving no student behind. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 has forced policymakers and educationists around the globe to explore alternate and innovative ways of learning. It will take some time to adopt them and have effective implementation of these policies. I once again would like to express my best wishes to all the scholars for their deliberations and congratulate Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for this event. I wish you all very lively, healthy, interactive, engaging, and fruitful discussions ahead. I thank you all for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister, for your remarks. You shared with us the impact of COVID-19 on education, and we are delighted to know the steps taken by government to meet the challenges posed by COVID-19 in the education sector of Nepal. We also wish you best wishes. Now we would like to invite Professor Anuradha Chenoy. Professor Anuradha Chenoy is a former Dean of School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has been the chairperson of Area Studies, director in the Center of Russian and Central Asian Studies. She has written extensively on security studies, development studies, and gender studies. She has also worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross, UNESCO, ActionAid International, UN Women, UN Peacekeepers, and several others. She has also evaluated the work of organizations like Focus on the Global South and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. Professor Chenoy, we would Professor Chenoy was like my guardian at JNU, not only to me, but to almost all the Nepalese students of JNU. She always supported and encouraged us. Madam, thank you for your kind presence. Professor Chenoy, you would be speaking on the importance of international relations. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pramod. Honourable Minister of Education of Nepal, Mr. Giriraj Pokharel, Director of the National Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, Pramod Jaiswal, distinguished co-panelists, participants, and friends. I'm deeply honoured to be a part of this engagement with so many scholars of international relations and present my thoughts on why it is important to understand IR, international relations, and the current geopolitical transitions. Now, in our contemporary reality, there are two things which impact us all across countries, across genders, classes, identities. One is COVID-19 and the second, global recession. Now, to really understand this as an example is to understand the changes, developments, interlinkages in the international system, the global political economy, and for this, IR is a major tool. Now, IR can help us explain this if we choose the right framework to do this. And I'm saying this especially for the over 250 young scholars who are present. Now, traditionally, IR was understood as a study of relations between states or multilateral institutions. Area studies was part of it, national security, international laws, but all these were dominated by the realist framework, focusing on states and power relations between them. This has, with internal variations, remained fairly hegemonic, the whole argument on realism. But I argue that many features of IR cannot be explained only through realism, even though dimensions of behavior can be shown up by this. For example, balance of power, entente, alliances, and other such behavioral aspects can be explained by realism. Realism, however, has been challenged many times, but still remained hegemonic. The challenges have come from, for example, from the constructivists, who showed that IR was not stagnant process, but in continuous construction, and that identity construction, for example, was a key part of understanding it. It was questioned by Marxists who argued that without understanding class, imperialism, global political economy, and its material basis, you could not really understand IR. Gramsci lent the idea of hegemony as social ascendancy of social forces, extending beyond force and threat, but embedded in social practices from religion, ideologies like nationalism, racism, and promoted through media, education, and other cultural practices. Added to this was a critique by the feminist IR theorists, who showed that realism was really an aspect of masculinist hegemony, since there was no femininity that is hegemonic so far. That the structure of this asymmetric power between men and women entered into social, political, and economic and institutional domains and has a common thread of dominance of men over women. And so it is important to bring gender into IR and into all relations. In understanding of IR, this is absolutely critical for security, for understanding peace building. So feminists argue that how can a theory of international relation or any other theory be built exclusively that represent men and exclude women and externalize them? How can it be an acceptable or universal theory? Now, on the shoulders of these stands the theories of human security paradigms, that asks that security be broadened to be freedom from fear and freedom from want, bringing rights and freedoms into IR debates. So really, young scholars have a lot to choose from these theories. They can use any of them to frame their arguments. Further, there is a new trend of being hybrid that young scholars may take from many theories as long as they do not contradict each other. So now I turn to the main trends in this COVID and post-COVID international geopolitics, because clearly geopolitics and international relations is in transition. And I submit 10 very brief points of how I understand this new transition. Now, 1, the US continues to be the greatest power, even while China catches up as a manufacturing and financial power. The formulation of the 1990s and 2000s of relevant, very relevant. So, however, US behavioral moves determine the trajectory of other powers. Second, Russia and China are major capitalist states and independent powers, but they are reactive powers in the international system. They do not wish for a new Cold War, even while this is being touted by many US strategists that there's a possibility of a new Cold War. But Russia and China are willing to be accommodative of the US. They want, however, to expand their influence without the US blocking them in their own zones of influence. And what are these zones? For Russia, it includes the former states of USSR, and for China, the territories it has marked for itself from the old feudal Chinese maps. These territories are regional, and they include controlling Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong completely, border areas of India, Central Asia, and maritime islands, and control of the Indo-Pacific. Now, they're willing to negotiate these, but their agenda doesn't change. Now, a third point is that the US, however, remains the main driver of these international politics and policies, and seeks to maintain hegemony through military, economic, and soft power, which is a huge range of power. And in a lot of these, despite all the issues going on in the US currently, the polarization, the protest movements, Black Lives Matter, they're not willing to accommodate Russia, but especially China. China has been marked out as a threat to the US. Now, the COVID-19, my fourth point, is that COVID-19 and the recession that follows has taken the wind out of several emerging powers. But at the same time, China's assertive behavior with various states continues while it builds alliances with other states. Now, the states which China is managing to have, assertive relations includes India, the Philippines, Vietnam, and some others, while it builds the BRI, which is a key project for China. Now, what happens with this aggressive behavior of both China and the US is that many of the emerging powers are being pushed into different alliances. For example, Russia is being pushed into a closer alliance with China, whereas Brazil and India are really seeking to have closer alliances with the US. There's no clear alliance pattern which has changed, but strategic relations have developed. Now, at the same time, regional and sub-regional imperialisms, whether these are of Turkey, UAE, India, Brazil, Japan, Malaysia, and others also continue. So moving then into my fifth point, which is this scenario is very different than the post-World War II Cold War, with this new Cold War which is being talked about. Since the old Cold War was a systemic confrontation based on ideology and clash of economic systems and interests. while the possible confrontation now is competitive within a neoliberal globalization and capitalist revival. And they're capitalist rivals. So they're all the same, similar systems. The main competition is between the US as a main superpower and two challengers. The main challenger, of course, is China, but Russia can also challenge them militarily, though they wouldn't really like to. There is also competition and yet alliance between Russia and China. So there are these pulls and pressures. Beneath these are the trade wars, the global political economy, the new financial systems, the use of soft power, etc., which we talked of in the various theories of IR. My sixth point is that US leads the arms race and the race for trade and finance, followed by its military and flag. My seventh point is that despite the catch-up which China is doing and is quite successful at, it will not be number one. They tried to be part of a G2, which was rejected by the US, but the US has power to renew itself democratically. It's continuously churning, getting ideas, whereas both Russia and China are bureaucratic capitalisms now with little soft power, and their legitimacy is constantly being questioned on the international stage because of various domestic and neighborhood policies. My eighth point is that Asian, European, and especially small countries, and here I especially point at Nepal, they will try to seek gains between these alliances and confrontations, just as some countries did by forming the non-aligned movement, though that movement has kind of trailed off now. But for small countries like Nepal, it is important to develop. And for this development, they need to, in my opinion, retain their fierce independence. They need to be fiercely independent. They need to be pro-people. They need to be democratic rather than become client states of either of these powers, emerging traditional superpowers, etc., because that invites interventions and things that you don't really want to do. Ninth, this is my second last point, is in today's international politics, international relations, and when studying even bilateral relations, you must think of a world which is ecologically and environmentally sustainable, policies that are equitable for peace and justice with global peace initiatives. And lastly, my 10th point, my conclusion is that I wish the people of Nepal and Nepal the best. I wish the best for this wonderful conference, and thanks to Pramod, my student and friend now, who is doing such a great job in NIICE. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Anuradha Chenoy. Next, we have Ms. Bandana Rana. Ms. Bandana Rana is the first Nepali candidate to serve in the United Nations Committee for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. She is currently the executive president of Sathi, an NGO working on violence against women and children in Nepal. She is also the regional coordinator of South Asian Campaign for Gender Equality and led the campaign in the region since 2006. Since 2004, she has been strongly advocating for the implementation of UNSCR 1325. She worked with the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction as a lead consultant on the technical working group for developing the UNSCR 1325 and 1820 National Action Plan of Nepal, which was adopted in February 2011. From October 2010, she is also the member of Asia Pacific Advisory Group for Women, Peace and Security for UNESCAP. Ms. Rana has in the past served as the chairperson of National Women Commission of Nepal. She has also worked with media and several international organizations in the past. Ms. Rana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal, for that very kind introduction. Honorable Minister, distinguished panelists, and all the youth from so many countries who are joining this summit of the young scholars. 2020, one of my key resolution was engaging with the youth. Must be an aging problem. So I think I'm doing pretty good, and this is an opportunity for me to again intensify my engagement with the youth. So thank you so much for this opportunity. It was wonderful to hear Anuradha Chenoy, who I'm seeing after a long time. Very interesting facts, and you have really enriched me in terms of international power structures, alliances, and what smaller countries need to do. So thank you so much for this opportunity to listen to her as well. Well, I will be speaking more from a practitioner's point of view rather than an academic or scholarly point of view. So it is based on my work of 3 decades working with women and gender-based violence nationally, regionally, and globally, and also as a CEDAW committee member now. So I have been asked to talk on gendered impact of the COVID-19. So we all know that the world has turned upside down. Not even the most developed countries were prepared for this kind of pandemic, leave alone the smaller countries who had simply no preparation, and moreover, their existing infrastructures have been even more weakened. So that is the kind of turmoil that this pandemic has brought about. And it has also, like in past pandemics, it has been proven that pandemics deepen existing inequalities, including gender inequality. So in this case, the COVID-19 has been increasingly deepening those inequality gaps as well. I don't have to tell you that women are the front line of all kinds of response, whether as healthcare workers, teachers, essential staff, and as carers in their families and communities. And on this basis, I would like to point out some significant impacts that the COVID-19 has brought about disproportionately on women and girls, particularly related to gender-based violence, access to health services, economic impact, and education. These are 4 sectors that I will touch a bit and see what kind of impact, I'll take you through to. Let me take first of all about gender-based violence. Even before the pandemic, we know about global statistics where 1 out of every 3 women have suffered or are suffering every day some or the other form of violence. And out of the total number of violence that women face, 40% face domestic violence. This is the statistics before the pandemic. Now we can imagine when the pandemic and with the lockdowns that have been announced in so many countries, this 40%, let's leave out the other statistics, but just let's look at the 40% who faced domestic violence. So this 40% are now during lockdowns confined with a perpetrator 24/7, with a person who has a very violent mentality, or there are unequal power structures within the family and increasing burden of work. Definitely the perpetrator is going to bring out all his frustrations and violence on the person who is weaker in the sense in a family, and that's usually a woman or a girl. So we can imagine the statistics that was 40% during normal times definitely will increase during this lockdown time. However, if we look at statistics that has been coming from several countries and has been included in UN policy briefs, we have seen even most developed countries like China, Canada, Australia, UK, Germany, Spain, Italy, who have reported that gender-based violence or domestic violence particularly has increased by 25 to 30%, in many countries to 40%. And even this is reported as a tip of the iceberg because so many cases have not been, due to lack of access to services and access to communication have not been reported. So this is what the scenario looks like. If you look at Nepal, there have been some indicative studies done by civil society organizations, which indicate that there has been a 50% increase on gender-based violence. But again, this is a very limited indicative study done within a span of 1 month. to see what it is like. Even the calls that have been received by the National Women's Commission in its hotline do say that the increase in calls have risen by 50%. Okay, so I was coming to the services that are there that used to cater to women or respond to women who suffer domestic violence. In many cases, even in the developing countries, most services had been weakened, and victims of violence could not reach out to those services for a number of reasons. One was because of the proximity. You know, in many cases, people live in one room, two rooms in very close proximity, shelter homes. So that was one thing. But the other is even shelter homes. Let's look at the services. I personally am a founder of a number of shelters, women's shelters in Nepal, and still supervise and give directions to the Sathis shelters as well. And what the first reaction was, we will not be able to take newcomers because there was lack of testing facility in the initial lockdown period in many countries. And you are not sure whether the newcomers that we may take in during the lockdown period maybe there is a very immense risk of they transmitting the virus to the others who are staying there. But of course, we had consultations, and we said on a human rights perspective, we do need to keep ourselves open. And we did a rapid assessment of also how shelters have been functioning during the lockdown period. But we said we would need to keep it open. But what are the safety measures? Most shelters have 1 or 2 toilets, common toilets, of course. Most shelters do not have adequate additional space to manage quarantine spaces. You know, so because of that reason also, they were not able to respond to victims who came up to them during the lockdown period. In the case of Sati, which is an NGO that I'm a founder, and I still give strategic direction. In the case of Sati, we separated one room as a quarantine space, and since we had 2 toilets, 1 toilet for the newcomers, but that also, the trauma that the existing victims who were already there in the shelters, they were so traumatized because of the fear and the kind of messages that were coming about, that they even actually called up the police saying that Sati is going to kill us. They are bringing in new residents with the virus, and we're going to get transmitted. So we had to also respond to the trauma of the existing residents in the shelter, and we planned to have a emergency alternative shelter in a head office, which was closed because everyone was working from home. But when we wanted to do that, we needed to buy some amenities for the new emergency shelter. So during the lockdown, we needed a license or a permission from the authorities to be able to purchase these things. And it was a long battle. We had to, we requested the chief district officer of the district that we work in. And finally, it took a couple of days. And finally, they said, shelter services is not under essential services. So you see, in many cases, shelter services is not even, responding to victims of violence is not even considered as essential services. Whereas there are other menial things that were getting licenses, and you know, their mobility was very free. So that's the kinds of so existing shelters, existing response services have been weakened during this period, and they are not able to respond in their full capacity and ability to the victims of violence. So this is the kind of scenario that we have in terms of gender-based violence. Let me talk a little bit about the economic impact. We all know that mostly it's women who work, it is the women who work in the informal sector or as home-based workers. So, you know, there's statistics from ILO which says by June, 70% of women domestic workers have lost their job. Yesterday, I was reading a newspaper article from the Daily News Kantipur over here in Nepal, which cited a study done by UNDP and International Integrated Institute, which says 48% women in Nepal lost their jobs compared to 28% of men. So we can see that these women who have lost their jobs, who have been working as home-based workers, who have been working in the informal sector, they were the ones who lost their jobs mostly, or even if they don't have safety, security safety insurances, no health insurances, And moreover, their income has decreased, of course, but moreover, the work that they need to do in the house has increased 4 or 5 times more, you know. Even in normal times, it is said that the unpaid care work that women do are 3 times more than men, and that is an unrecognized, unpaid care work. But now, with the pandemic, women, either they have lost their job, they have lost income, and in the homes now they have to cater to the families who are in the house 24/7, particularly the children who have to, who have to also follow Zoom classes. If you are a working woman, you have to manage the household, you have to cook, you have to look after the children, look after their homeworks, arrange for their Zoom classes. All this needs to be done. So the burden of the women have increased manyfold during this time. So that is the other, impact, the economic impact that we can see. And in the UN policy brief, it is said that by next year, if this case continues, 47 million women will have been pushed, will be leading an impoverished life and will be pushed to extreme poverty by next year. And there's another statistics which says that this is all UN policy briefs, which says that by next year, between the age group of 25 to 35 men and women, for every 100 women, there will be 118 women living in extreme poverty. And this will increase by 2030 to 121 women to every 100 women. So women will be extremely living an impoverished life. That is the scenario that we can predict for the next, as we respond to this. There's another thing that I want to pinpoint because we come from a country where many women migrate to foreign countries for foreign employment. So migration is also hit very hard during this pandemic. There are many women who are able to return from wherever they were migrating and working and reunite with their family. But in many cases, they have lost income. Some women have come back sexually abused with illegal pregnancies and with very little capacity on the state to respond to this problem that the migrant women are facing. In some cases, the migrant women who are illegal migrants do not have a proper contract papers. They are not able to come back to their own countries. And during this lockdown period, they have been forced to work beyond their capacity, which was beyond their contract as well. And there has been sexual abuse and other forms of abuse. So this is the kind of impact that we can perceive in terms of economic impact for women. In terms of health impact, we all know the frontline workers in the health system are 70% women. But if you look at the 70 to 90%, that is what it said. But if you look at the decision-making role, only 30% women are in the decision-making role of the health sector. And when you look at the PPEs that are made, it is usually made in a standard way to fit a man. So, even the frontline workers, security, safety measures are not taken into account. About access to health services, there's a deprioritization of maternal and reproductive health. Standard hospitals have been transformed into COVID hospitals, and the services that they were providing have been shifted to smaller health posts who are not capable to provide that kind of holistic services. But, there is, from 2000 to 2017, the maternal mortality rate had fallen by 40%, but now there is very high risk that this percent will rise again, and there will be a big loss. So there are also, there was a newspaper article that I read on Nepal in the month of, I think it was April, that compared to the last 2 years, the number of pregnant women who came to seek services had fallen down by 50%. So where did they disappear? Where did they go? They either did not access health services, or they, because of the mobility restrictions and also because services were not available. So health sector is also a huge sector that is being impacted in terms of gender lens. Education, it's always been a gender digital divide in education, but now with all the classes and education taking place with this new technology virtually in Zoom, we can imagine, it's okay to have, there are very few houses which has very adequate facilities for children to be able to access education through this technology. But there are thousands and millions of houses who do not have this technology. And even when they have this technology, it may be limited. And if you had a boy and a girl, the preference is to the boy. There's one laptop, one connection, so the preference would be to a boy. And our experience has shown from a previous pandemic like Ebola in West Africa, that after the pandemic, the dropout rates of girls increased drastically. So this is an impact that from the education. Now, what needs to be done and what have some countries done? I would just like to end by giving some examples of what we could do. First of all, I would like to say that UN, of course, has, the prime priority of UN is protecting the rights of women and girls. And during this time, and there has been a policy brief that has been taken out by the UN early in April, calling on governments to take concrete action to put women and girls, their inclusion, representation, rights, social and economic outcomes, and protection at the center of all efforts. And CEDAW has also come up in April itself with a CEDAW guidance note, which has a 9-point advising governments to see how the gendered impact of COVID-19 can be addressed by member states. Some of the immediate things that needs to be done is every country should come up with an immediate national response program, which puts women at the center, and women's participation needs to be ensured. There needs to be a gender analysis of the impact, consistent gender analysis, in fact, and designate women's shelters and other support services as essential services, and to continue and expand online services as well. Recognition of unpaid care work, putting money into the hands of women who work in both the formal and informal economies. Cash transfers, credits, and loans should be targeted at women to mitigate the immediate impact of job losses and increased caring responsibilities. Expand social safety nets and recognize the value of invisible and unpaid care work. Prioritizing and funding primary health care and universal health coverage. Of course, awareness needs to be intensified. Information on support services available should reach out to the targeted community. Messages needs to be in the language they speak of and the way they understand. Data collection is extremely important. It's the key. And in closing, I would also like to say that the progress that we had made in the last so many years, and with the 2030 agenda ahead of us, the loss that we may face now may take generations, not years, but generations to recover. So we really need to be cautious and see how we can work together. And I think collective work is key. The governments, civil society, academics, private sector, we all need to work together to ensure the rights to life, dignity, and society for everyone with a fair and non-stereotyped mindsets. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for your remarks. May I now request Ambassador Gyan Chandra Acharya. Ambassador Gyan Chandra Acharya served as the UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing countries from September 2012 to March 2017. He also coordinated and advocated work related to the LDCs, LLDCs, SIDS in forum and platform outside the United Nations. Ambassador Acharya was a member of the United Nations Senior Management Group and the High-Level Task Force for Global Food Security, as well as Commissioner on the High-Level Broadband Commission for Sustainable Digital Development. He has also served as the advisory board of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, co-chaired by the UN Secretary General and the President of the World Bank. In November 2014, Mr. Acharya served as the Secretary General of the Third UN Conference on Landlocked Developing Countries held in Vienna, Austria. Ambassador Acharya has 3 decades of experience in the diplomatic service of Nepal, during which he was involved in articulation and promotion of bilateral, regional, and global issues. Prior to joining the UN, Ambassador Acharya was permanent representative of Nepal in the United Nations in New York, during which he chaired the LDC Global Coordination Bureau for over 2 years and was a member of LLDC Global Bureau. He was Foreign Secretary with Government of Nepal and Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization in Geneva, a spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry and Joint Secretary, Director General responsible for South Asia, Europe, and Americas, and Regional Organization Economic Relations and Coordination Division from 1998 to 2003. He will be speaking on multilateralism and global and regional order, including the impact of COVID-19 on LDCS. Ambassador Acharya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pramodji, for your very long and generous introduction. I think that was not necessary. People can really look at, but again, thank you very much for that. Dear coordinator of the program, Pramodji, distinguished speakers, and all those who have joined this online program. First of all, I'd like to thank NIICE, in particular, Dr. Pramodji, for his very energetic initiative at organizing this International Young Scholars Summit on contemporary issues of importance to us all. I think involving them, especially the younger academics, from an early stage is really timely and imperative, and I'm sure that it will have a very huge impact in really changing the thinking as well as the implementation of various important policies related to international relations in the days ahead. As you said, I think I would like to talk a little bit about this multilateralism and the order. This is a little bit towards more idealism and pragmatism, perhaps, rather than the pure realism that we heard about from the presentation by Professor Anuradha. I hope that this will also complement what has been already talked about in terms of the global order. Let me begin with the first part. We all know that we are in the midst of a very monumental change. The liberal international order established after the Second World War is under tremendous stress now. A fair and just global order is always aspirational and work in progress. Some of the basic international principles like open, consultative, and consensus-based norms and rules of behaviors, non-aggression, respect for sovereign equality, collective security, cooperative multilateral consensus, promotion of human rights, global cooperation and fundamental social and economic issues, largely guided international engagements over the last 7 decades. The prominent role of the United Nations and other multilateral forums in many of the issues is also very visible. We have to look at multilateral principles, multilateral initiatives, and the multilateral institutions to really understand how multilateralism as a whole has really affected the global order as well as the regional developments. Many international agreements and arrangements, from disarmament to trade, human rights to climate change, and MDGs to now the Global Development Framework, which is called SDGs, have underpinned our international conduct of relations and guided global cooperation. This liberal order had its ups and downs. Even in the best of the times, those rules were difficult to hold substantively. But the developments in the recent years have now seriously questioned the effectiveness of some of those arrangements. There is a major rebalancing of power going around the world. This includes both hard power and soft power. Within that overarching power shifts, new variables have also sharpened and accelerated the contest. I would like to just point out a couple of things, like opening of new frontiers of science and technology, such as quantum computing, AI, and robotics, and its dispersal, globalization of production, consumption, and travel, digital communications, a liberal rules-based trade regime, rising global prosperity and our growing capabilities on the one hand, and precipitous depletion of natural resources with profligacy, climate change impacts, conflicts and disasters, poverty, instability, and violations of human rights around the world, as well as rising inequality on the other are stark realities, and I would say contrasting realities of the world today. It has perhaps reminded ourselves of what Charles Dickens said: it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. I hope that it remains the age of wisdom, not the age of foolishness. Even before the coronavirus, I think multilateralism is going through a lot of stress in dealing with the prominent challenges because of the competing interests, growing conflicts of major powers, and lack of reform to reflect the current realities. In the era of old Cold War before 1990s, these differences were also as sharp as this one in ideological and military and security, as well as to some extent economic terms. But the current context of power is different because of the growing multipolarity today, deep and comprehensive interdependence in its scope and reach, integrated nature of the world, hyperglobalization, if you like, and with rising adverse global ramifications. When you look at the climate change impact, disasters and the environment, degradation, air pollution, crossing the borders and all of that, this has really integrated the whole world in that sense. Therefore, the influence of changing geopolitics is visible in our immediate vicinity as well as in our extended neighborhood, and the context has affected multilateral world as well. I must say that this nationalistic approach, unilateralism, disruption of rules and principles, growing marginalization of multilateral institutions and rising conflicts of major powers, with indications towards decoupling in production and trade and technology, doesn't augur well for the international community. We should delve deeper into them to better understand their multifaceted and the long-term implications. The Freedom House has stated that 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. COVID-19, I think, has sharpened that and accelerated some of those processes with additional challenges of health security, closures, disruptions of value chains and production networks, unprecedented reduction in global growth, employment, trade, and investment. Because Corona is not only a health crisis, it is a livelihood crisis, it is an economic crisis, and a global crisis, it is going to affect the whole modality of global engagements and cooperation. Therefore, I would say that integrated and hyper-globalized world and growing impacts of global public goods, and I would say global public bads as well, will affect more now than ever before. And those most vulnerable will be further marginalized. This will be a recipe for more instability. Therefore, we have to really look at how multilateral institutions like United Nations, international finance institutions, and World Trade Organizations play a critical role in taking forward a collective, cooperative world order. While we should reform them to make them more representative and reflective of the current realities, with due representation of both the small and the big nations, a stronger commitment to the multilateral principles that restrains, I should say, the primacy of power remain our highest hope and safer anchor to ensure inclusiveness, fairness, and collective progress and prosperity. I think considering the current nature of global challenges and cross-border implications of all of our activities, no single country, how powerful it may be, can deal with them effectively. Let me turn a little bit to the regional situation. We have no pan-Asian regional security and economic forum. There are multiple major powers, both established and emerging in the region. Asia-Pacific region, we all know, has 60% of the global population, but it is also a continent with largest number of nuclear powers. It has been the fulcrum of the global growth with consistently high collective economic growth rates in the last several decades. And some reports suggest that it is expected that it will fuel almost 60% of the global growth and perhaps even add 90% of the middle class by 2030. So Asia-Pacific region has the largest share of international trade than its share of the global trade, GDP, and it increases per capita income 15-fold in the last 40 years. I think these are indicators that this, region, the Asia-Pacific region will be the driving force for the 21st century, and people have called it even the Asia-Pacific century. So it is also true, I think we have to really remember that it is also true that the highest number of the poor and the deprived people are also in the Asia-Pacific region after the sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, environmental degradation, disasters, and water pollution and scarcity, and climate change impacts are being felt more seriously here in the region, and then many, compared to many other regions as well. A SCAP report 2020 says that the Asia-Pacific region stands now at a critical, crossroads where it can transform itself from an economic growth leader, and I think it should be now moving towards that direction to be a pioneer in sustainable development. Because when you look at the overall challenges as well as opportunity, I think we have a lot of, the hope that we will be moving towards sustainable development of the Asia-Pacific region in the coming years. Against this background, of course, the geostrategic competition is taking place in the region among, the powers of the region, but also with outside powers. Border disputes and conflicts and arms race and modernization are increasing at an accelerated pace, and mistrust and misunderstanding are also major challenges, especially among major powers. Therefore, we have seen that different manifestation of, the Macinder's heartland theory as well as Mahan's theory of sheer power is being played out perhaps in the region as well. But I think it is very important for us to really see that how this modus operandi and the modus vivendi will be arranged in the years ahead, will be largely ensuring peace, security, and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and the whole world at large. A major conflict in the region will be devastating for all, especially when all the countries in the region has a long way to go to ensure decent standard of living and sustainable development to the vast number of their population. I think therefore, what I would ultimately say is that management of this great power competition, reduction of conflict and tension, enhancement of cooperative arrangements, peaceful order, building trust and understanding are really critical. We all have a role to play. I think reinforcing those multilateral principles in the regional context as well would be equally important to ensure stability and predictability in the region. Let me now turn to the little bit on the South Asia. South Asian sub-region is also a study in contrast. We all know the region is vibrant with high economic growth and young population. We all know that, but also has a huge burden of extreme poverty, disasters, and growing environmental challenges. Because of strong historical and cultural linkages, we have always considered these countries as natural partners. Yet, despite our regional cooperation, SAARC, and multitude of other bilateral cooperation frameworks, critical regional indicators show us a picture of a least integrated region. Regional trade, regional investment, regional connectivity, and regional value chains are all either very low or negligible. Conflicts between the two major countries in the South Asia region have played a big role in limiting the nature of regional cooperation, and we must do more with clear political direction, enhancing better understanding on mutual benefit in some important economic areas with regional cooperation. Going forward, more cooperation at the regional and bilateral levels between the countries of the region in trade, transit, production network, connectivity, water and energy cooperation, disasters, and environmental preservation with fair and mutually beneficial arrangements could be a real game changer, I believe, for the whole of South Asia. I think equally important for us is to contribute to confront all this, isolationism and unilateralism that is going around the world. COVID-19 has once again reinforced that there is no alternative to cooperation and collaboration. I think in depth research in those areas will also help promote opinions in favor of a collaborative, open, and prosperous regional and global order. I think it is very important, therefore, a dispassionate analysis, coherent approach, stronger nexus between research and policy making, and longer-term thinking will make very important contribution in this turbulent time. And I hope that the organization like the NIICE, which is promoting these younger researchers, would contribute really to bring that in the forefront and perhaps even contribute to the out-of-box solution, which is what we really need. I think these solutions are in short supply today, and we all have a role to play, and I think we all have a stake in it. Now, briefly going to the COVID-19 and its impact on the vulnerable countries like LDC, I think that has also a very strong relevance in regard to the global as well as regional order, because so many countries, the least developed countries are in South Asia. And also, they are faced with the fundamental challenges of their structural constraints. Now, in addition to these structural changes, now these have a huge COVID-19 impact, affecting them. When you look at the least developed countries, just briefly, they are at the bottom of development ladder. If you look at that, and they represent the most, the number of the poorest and the most vulnerable segment of the international community. If you look at the global level, there are 47 countries all over the world. 33 are in Africa, 13 are in Asia Pacific region, and you have 4 in South Asian region, and there is 1 Haiti in Latin America. And if you look at the total population of these countries, they're almost like 900 million people, and that is almost about 12% of the global population, but they represent only 2% of the global GDP and probably even 1 or 1.2% of the global trade. And that means that their overall, the economic fundamentals are very, very weak, and their overall representation in the global level is very limited. And if you look at their, the typical structure, they have a low human development with high level of multidimensional poverty. They have a very, the low per capita GNI, which is also reflected because of this low income, and also high degree of vulnerability from all the economic as well as the natural disasters. And their dependence on, the international cooperation is very high, and they're also the structure of economy is very limited. They are dependent on either 1 or 2 products for their export as well as economic growth, and those products are basically either primary products or the agriculture itself. That's why when we talk about transformation of their economy, it's a very big challenge, their internal challenge, but also a huge external challenge because it is, highly competitive world they have to compete with. So international community has come out with a number of support measures in regard to providing some support in terms of the official development assistance. 0.35% of that overall 0.7% of GDI is to go to the least developed countries. There is a duty-free, quota-free access being provided to them. But again, it is the trading capacity, it is the productive capacity within, and of course, the structural challenges that they face face, that has put them again in a very disadvantageous position in the world. Now, I think with very few, and just to give an example, idea of where we stand. If you look at the size of its international trade, it's almost 50% of GDP. So because it cannot produce so many things within, that's why it has to depend a lot on the international trade. And if you look at the trade, the import-export ratio, it is very, very uneven. It's 90-10. Even the best of the countries in the LDCs category around the world is about 40-60 or 30-70, 70% import and 30% export. That's why they have a very weak productive and trading capacity. Second, we can see that their dependence on the remittances is very high. In case of Nepal, it is extremely high, which is 25% of GDP. Official development assistance is still comprises a very important segment of their development expenditure, although their internal, the domestic resource capacity has gradually improved. In case of Nepal, in fact, it is one of the very good ones, 25% of GDP. But again, if you look at their dependence on tourism, although it is a 5 to 7% of their GDP, again, it indirectly benefits more than 1 million people. So when you look at all of that, this is a typical feature of a vulnerable economy with a very limited manufacturing capacity, a non-tradable services sector in the economy. That's why when the COVID-19 hit countries like those, as I said earlier, it is not only a health, of course, the health situation is typically very, very constrained and very, very limited, and limited facilities are there. Then you have a huge economic impact. Now that the global economy itself is being affected tremendously, when you look at the global reports now, UNCTAD says there will be a 40% reduction in FDI. WTO says 35% reduction in trade. And the World Bank says 20% reduction in the remittances sector. And the World Tourism has said about 60 to 70% reduction in tourism. You can see not only the immediate impact of the health and the current livelihood related challenges, but also a very strong medium-term challenges in the LDCs like Nepal and other countries. Therefore, they also have very limited domestic support measures. If you look at the global support measures nowadays, those who have a higher capacity, in fact, have a higher percent of GDP as a domestic support. Look at the United States, look at Europe and other. Those who are in the middle have a middle level between 8 to 10 to 12%, even India and others. And then countries like Nepal has even lower than that in terms of the support measures, because they simply don't have a capacity. So the current support measures has been calculated around 4 to 5% of the GDP. And that again is also very limited. That's why I think it is very important that all these initiatives that has been taken now at the global level by the World Bank with the enhancement of the lending facilities, the IMF with the more emergency facilities, and also ADB tripling its size of investment in response to the COVID-19, and WHO also coming out with some of the response to the December, up to December 2020, and the strategic preparedness programs are very important. But we have to remember that these initiatives, while are very important, but how much of that is really going to these countries is really critical for them. And compared to the scale and intensity of cooperation and the challenges that they face, I think we have to really look at all of that. And we should see that while there is a very important that these countries should be able to get access to those resources and the support mechanisms which are there, but also how that will be played out in the medium term would be really very, very important. And that's why I think the cooperation and collaboration, but also really looking at the vulnerability of these countries, will be really critical. I think that is when we look at the global, the cooperation, we do hope that we'll have, of course, the global support for everyone. That is very important, but especially now that we have to really take care of the immediate impact of the global, the impact of the COVID-19. But when this, the vaccine is developed, how it is distributed, how the equitability of access is ensured is really critical. And when you look at the global support nowadays, I think I was just looking at some of the figures. Global Call for COVAX initiative is not getting the type of the support it used to get. The humanitarian support used to get a lot of international contributions and cooperation in the past, but even that is not coming up that strongly. Even the major powers are not contributing that much. I think that's why it is really very difficult if we are really talking about the long-term peace, prosperity, and cooperative international global order. We have to really look at the particular vulnerabilities and the challenges of the countries which are at the bottom of not only the development ladder, but also the challenges. Now, there was also some reference about Nepal's foreign policy earlier. I'd just like to say a couple of words. I think that would be my final point. I think it is very important for all of us to really understand that fundamentals of any foreign policy, like any other nation, is of course to maintain independence and sovereignty of each country, and that is precisely what Nepal would be doing, has been doing, and will be continuing to do it. But again, I think it is very important for a country like Nepal, which is situated between the two strategically important countries, to really promote very active foreign policy, but very strong focus on balanced relationship with neighbors, but also very strong diversification of its relationship with the international community. These are very important manifestation of assertion of not only our independence, but also consolidation of our internal strength, consolidation of our contribution to promote the peaceful, stable, democratic, and prosperous Nepal for all of us. I think our constitution talks about a very high degree of the collaboration within the federal and the democratic structure. I think that requires a very strong support from the neighboring countries, but also from the international community to really to attain its objective of a very strong, but also a very active and the collaborative nation in the international community. Democratic norms, federal structure, respect for human rights are fundamental features of our new constitution, and long-term success of the country also depends on maintaining a very strong balanced relationship, but also diversification of relationship to enhance its opportunity, but also strengthen its prosperity within the country in an inclusive manner for all of those which are there in the country. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador Acharya, for your remarks. Now I'd like to request Professor Amitabh Mattoo to make his remarks. Professor Amitabh Mattoo is currently professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and honorary professor at the University of Melbourne. Professor Mattoo has been visiting professor at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, John Cork Institute of Peace Studies, University of Notre Dame, and at the Program of Arms Control, Disarmament, and International Security at University of Illinois, at Urban Campaign, and at the Maison des Sciences de Monet at Paris. Professor Mattoo was Vice Chancellor of University of Jammu and was the youngest person to serve at that position. He served as a member of National Knowledge Commission, a high-level advisory group to the Prime Minister of India, a member of the Governing Council of the PAGWAS Conference on Science and World Affairs, the Nobel Prize-winning NGO which campaigned for global disarmament. He is currently president of Indian Association of International Studies. Professor Mattoo has been a member of India's National Security Council Advisory Board and was also a member of the task force constituted by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh on global strategic development. He is a member of Executive Committee of Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, served on the Research Committee of the Institute of Defense Studies and NIICE, and is a member of Executive Council of Central University of Karnataka. He is also a director of India-Afghanistan Foundation. Professor Mattoo has served as the Governing Council of Nuclear Science Center and has been member of the Standing Committee of Association of Indian Universities. He was decorated with Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian award in 2008, for his contribution to education. Professor Mattoo was awarded the Kimpro Platinum Standard Award in 2008 and was recognized as a national statesman for his work in the field of education, along with Mr. Anand Mahindra, who was awarded for his leadership in business. Professor Mattoo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal. Let me also acknowledge, first of all, the presence of the Honourable Minister for Education, Science and Technology, Mr. Giriraj Pokharel, my dear colleague and former Dean of the School of International Studies, Professor Anuradha Chenoy, the Vice Chair of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, Ms. Bandana, Rana, Ambassador Gyan Chandra Acharya, former Foreign Secretary of Nepal and UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for Least Developed Countries. Let me, Dr. Jaiswal, also congratulate you for this really path-breaking initiative of organizing an International Young Scholar Summit, and also for really giving direction to the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, particularly during a period when physical proximity has not been possible. I've seen the manner in which NIICE has been able to create its own impact in the cyber world through its webinars, through its seminars, and you indicated yourself as well that you've had a range of speakers from Noam Chomsky of MIT to John Mearsheimer at Chicago to guests from all over South Asia. And this pioneering effort where you've managed to include 275 scholars from 25 countries over 3 days for this webinar is really to be lauded. And I do hope that this institute becomes an institute of excellence, which can create a niche for itself, unlike many of the other institutes which started with great promise but didn't really translate into didn't translate that promise into reality. International relations, particularly as a discipline, has really been a stunted discipline within most of South Asia. Even within India, although it has a long standing tradition beginning in the 1940s, you see the manner in which international relations has grown as a discipline has not really been with the same degree of theoretical rigor, academic scholarship, or policy interventions as disciplines like economics or even political science. And in other countries in South Asia, there has been similar issues. One of the reasons, of course, has been the fact that IR has been tied with the policy establishment. I'm glad that the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, while it does address issues of importance to policymakers and practitioners, it's also looking at the wider theoretical academic canvas, which is so important to conceptualize and understand international relations at this point, at this vantage point of history. What I thought I'll do, and this really builds on the arguments and the interventions made by earlier speakers. The minister, of course, talked about the manner in which education has been impacted upon by COVID and the manner in which online education has had to reinforce, complement traditional means of learning. Professor Chenoy talked about hybridity as a way of trying to address issues of security and issue challenges that we face, that looking at different models, looking at realism, but not just confining oneself to realism, but looking at issues of identity, hegemony, from a feminist perspective, a kind of eclectic hybrid approach to try and encapsulate the complexities of international relations. Ms. Bandana Rana really commendably brought home to us the manner in which women particularly have been marginalized or been most affected by the impact of COVID. And she gave graphic examples of the shelters and other facilities that were created or that face many of the challenges that COVID has imposed on all of us, wherever we are. And Ambassador Acharya, of course, gave us a great overview from a Nepalese perspective, but also from a more globalist perspective about the challenges facing the world. What I thought is really building on all these arguments, and it might be useful given the number of presentations that you have over the next few days. And I was looking at your program, it's really extremely comprehensive, is to raise in the next 15 minutes or so the 5 or 6 questions that confront us today as transit through a COVID world to what might be a post-COVID world. I mean, at this moment, it's unclear when we'll witness the post-COVID world in terms of a world being free of the terror that the pandemic has created. But we can visualize the main trends, perhaps, and in tune with the hybridity that Anuradha Chenoy signaled towards. This is a hybrid set of questions that I pose before you. The first question is from from the vantage point of realism. And I'll begin there, not only because it's a dominant school, not only because it has exercised in some ways disproportionate influence on the discipline of IR, or the fact that it is privileged conflict over cooperation, or that it's privileged the fact of states, Westphalian state structures more than other social and social movements, but also because there is a certain relevance to looking at present day or post-COVID international politics through the point of view of realism. And what would realism tell you in terms of what is the most important trend that we are witnessing today? That trend is the fact of the incipient but quite clearly defined Cold War that is upon us. Most people would like to imagine that we could, in a post-COVID world, and given the fact that COVID has impacted everyone everywhere, think of a world which is more collaborative. And yet, during the COVID period itself, we are witness to perhaps the most provocative confrontation short of war between the two great powers that exist today. A declining hegemonic power, United States. I just use that word because it's a convenient way of describing a country which is ruled by the most maverick leader in recent history, Donald Trump, and a rising China, a rising power, China, your neighbor, our neighbor. How will this confrontation play itself in a post-COVID world? Am I audible, Dr. Jaiswal?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Yeah, yeah. How will this confrontation play itself in the post-COVID world? Now, people have obviously drawn from civilizational examples to talk about what is described as a Thucydides trap, where there is almost an inevitability of a competition between a rising power and an existing hegemon, often translating into a war. And others have said that the world has changed far too much for us to experience the kind of confrontation that has existed between great powers, beginning with ancient civilizations to the Cold War that the Soviet Union and the United States confronted each other with. I'm not sure. I think you have today in China a country which is determined to establish itself, establish its presence, like most great powers in the past. The idea of Chinese exceptionalism, which, and there are people like Kishore Mehbubani, for instance, at the Lee Kuan Yew Center at the National University of Singapore, who still argue about Chinese exceptionalism. But the idea of Chinese exceptionalism, which was built on China being different from great powers, is becoming less and less convincing every day. What instead you see is that after 30 years of biding their time, as Deng Xiaoping had encouraged China to do, China feels that now is the time for it to cast its imprimatur, to advance its interests like great powers have done in the past. And when people say there should be a rules-based system, for the Chinese, these are rules created by someone else, by other powers to suit their interests. Whether it's the Chinese confrontation in terms of the border conflict with India, or within the East China Sea or the South China Sea, or the larger Chinese diplomatic aggression that we witnessed in other parts of the world, it's quite clear that this idea that somehow China had been socialized into accepting the international rules of the system was based either on a naive understanding of Chinese foreign policy or a misreading of Chinese strategic culture. Similarly, you have the United States, which is witnessing the most polarized partisan politics. And Anuradha Chenoy talked about the many civil society movements, but you also have it led by probably the most dysfunctional leadership. So you have a dysfunctional leadership of Donald Trump, and you have a confrontational authoritarian leadership of Xi Jinping. So even while we talk about COVID pandemic from a realist paradigm, the most important contradiction that continues to exist even now in what might be described as a transitory period from a COVID to a post-COVID world is a 19th century replay of great power politics. Even though global interdependence may have manifested itself in all sorts of ways, what you are witnessing is a 19th century style Cold War, which might translate into something more serious being played out in our region, being played out in the larger Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region. Second question, so first question is really what will happen to this Cold War? It's not going to fade away. It's not going to, the leadership of the United States and China has demonstrated that instead of viewing COVID-19 as a common threat to be addressed collectively, it has only widened the gulf, crystallized divisions, and generated greater tension and hostility. The second question is, what is the future of multilateralism? The former Foreign Secretary, the Ambassador, talked about this. The question, especially when, at a time when we are living with degrees of precariousness and precarity, as the feminist philosopher Judith Butler would put it, what is the future of multilateralism? We need multilateralism, we need collaboration, we need closer cooperation more than ever before, and yet the crisis of multilateralism is one which is perhaps unprecedented since the Bretton Woods system and the United Nations was created. Some people talk about how China is using multilateralism as a promotion, weaponizing multilateralism to advance its own interests. But clearly, two organizations, if you look at, which are central at this moment to our understanding of what, or to promoting prosperity, health and prosperity, the WHO and the WTO are in serious crisis. On the one hand, WHO has had a serious crisis of credibility ever since it seemed to have acted slowly in responding to the pandemic, and WTO's ability to set, in its terms of its dispute settlement mechanisms, is in serious crisis. So when you need multilateralism, multilateralism is in question. So if the first question is the Cold War, second question is multilateralism. When you need multilateralism in every single area, and I think lots of people refer to the fact that if a vaccine is developed, you need multilateral collaboration to ensure that everyone has equitable access to that vaccine. That even the most marginalized, vulnerable people of the world have access to a prophylactic which can prevent this pandemic from becoming more invasive and expansive. So the second question is, what is the future of multilateralism? The third question is really related to multilateralism, but more to do with our region. In some ways, the former Foreign Secretary's remarks illustrate this. Is that at a time when we need a South Asia which is much more integrated, South Asia is much, much more disintegrating. It's not just the lack of collaboration or cooperation, but given the perspective, from the perspective of India, its relations with many of its smaller neighbors is less than satisfactory. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, recently released a book, and at that book release, he talked about how the guiding mantra for relations with the smaller neighbors, eastern neighbors, should be non-reciprocity, which means you move one step further than you demand from the other side. But it's not patently obvious to the smaller neighbors that India is willing to act in a more magnanimous way than has been the case in the past. Certainly, from the point of view of India-Nepal relations, you are still trying to find an equilibrium in that relation. It's not a question of Nepal trying to balance and say that the right path is for it to have an independent, sovereign foreign policy. It's about how you maximize your interests through a cooperative path. At the moment, what is clear is that cooperation in South Asia is leading to suboptimal outcome for each one of these countries. Whether it's India, or it's Nepal, or it's Bangladesh, or it's Sri Lanka. To give you just a few examples, much more, and if you were to game this, and I hope that some of the papers presented here will look at cooperation in anarchy and look at many of the games, including Prisoner's Dilemma, to see how you can plot a payoff structure by which all these countries can be incentivized to collaborate and cooperate much more than they do so right now, through looking at the shadow of the future, looking at the fact that they will have to inhabit the same geography for the foreseeable future, unless there were huge tectonic forces that change that geography. So while there is a demand for a greater integrated neighborhood, and while Prime Minister Modi made that initial plea at the beginning of the pandemic to try and collectively address this issue, the fact is that intra-South Asia collaboration has shown relations, and I could argue that with everyone, that there is no such zero-sum relation, that the zero-sum relationship between India and Pakistan is not the primary reason for the lack of cooperation between India and its eastern neighbors. The fourth question, so the first question is the Cold War, the second question is multilateralism, the third question is regional integration. The fourth question is really, again, stems from many of the issues that I have raised, including multilateralism, is that on the one hand, and this is another paradox that we have represented, all these are paradoxes, these binary paradoxes in some ways. Fourth factor is that on the one hand, globalization has made us much more of a village, and yet the pandemic has meant that the state is returning with a vengeance. So even though virtually we are integrated, including through cyberspace, including through financial markets, including even now even though there's been some disruption of supply chains, and that might change over the future, even though there is globalization is in full swing, and yet states, borders, territory, sovereignty is fighting back with a vengeance. I mean, the fact is that half my family is in Melbourne, I can't visit them. The fact is that that you might need tomorrow a COVID permit, that you're COVID free to be able to even cross state boundaries. So the state is becoming much more powerful, almost in a Westphalian sense, while the globe is becoming a village, as demonstrated by the fact of the pandemic itself. So what will happen is the other question. Are we going to see a return of Westphalia with a vengeance, or are we going to see a borderless world? A return to almost a borderless world. The fifth question that I pose to you is another central question, is what about all the collective action problems, the global common problems that we are confronted with? Pandemics, the pandemic is one global problem, and there will be future pandemics. But what about climate change? What about demography? I think someone referred to demography. What about other issues related to the environment, including energy issues? What will be the mechanisms? What will be the efforts to combat issues like particularly climate change? And the impact of climate change and global warming will be so severe, and we now know that there is enough evidence to suggest that in 20, 30 years, there will be island states which will stop existing, who will have sovereignty without territory. Can you imagine that there will be states which will just go under? But there'll be sovereign states in the manner in which the United Nations and the international law recognizes them. And simultaneously, in terms of demography, this whole idea, and this is particularly true about the South Asian region, that we have the youngest population. 70% of our population, of the world's youth population, 50% of the youth population is in this region, 70% of our population is under 25. Will this become a demographic dividend, or will this become a demographic nightmare? And how do we ensure that the dividend remains a dividend and doesn't become a nightmare? And then a final question, which is about weapons of mass destruction and militarization. As technology advances itself, there'll be new weapons created, including weapons which can destroy your whole economy or destroy your own information systems through cyberspace, through weapons in cyberspace, but also they will coexist with traditional weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear. How will the post-COVID world address these issues when traditional regimes, traditional forms of multilateralism will be weaker than much than before the COVID world started? These are both intellectual, these are all these 5 or 6 questions are intellectual questions which will demand theoretical rigor drawn from what Anuradha Chenoy said, the hybridity of international relations, realism to constructivism to feminism. but also demand that academic scholars engage with policy makers. And really, I think what is important is that policymakers today realize that they need academia much more than before, because symptomatic treatment of many of the problems that will confront us today and tomorrow will require real diagnosis. Symptomatic treatment will provide palliative care for the moment, but will not provide real cure, long-term cure. And for that, you need the kind of diagnosis that only academics are able to engineer. And that's why it's important for academics to do their research, their scholarship, but also not move out of their ivory towers and engage with policymakers. And that's why a forum like the Nepal Institute is so critically important. I think it's valuable and important that you retain your independence, your non-partisanship, and given the fact that today, there's very little funding required to have a virtual institute, it's possible to do so with the freedom, with the economic freedom, which doesn't become dependent on the agenda of any foundation or thing or funding body. So I, Dr. Jaiswal, compliment you, congratulate you for organizing this youth summit, and I hope that you will stay the course, sustain this effort, because in this effort, I think you have invested personal time, but we, as scholars of international relations, have invested great hope. Thank you.
Professor Matu, thank you for your remark, and we'd also like to assure you that we will continue working hard and try to see NIICE as one of the leading think tanks of South Asia. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, here we come to the end of the inaugural session. I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers for being strictly on time. Now I'd like to request Ms. Sunaina Karki, Conference Coordinator and Research Associate at NIICE, to formally propose a vote of thanks.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Distinguished speakers, young scholars, friends from media, diplomatic corps, and dear audience, I deem it a great honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NIICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their parts to make this event a resounding success. First of all, we would like to express our profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to our eminent speakers who have joined us this Saturday morning and inspired us with their great words. We are honored by the presence of Honourable Minister of Education, Mr. Giriraj Pokharel. Thank you, sir, for giving such an excellent coverage to the education system in Nepal. We appreciate the work Government of Nepal is doing in the field of education under your leadership. Similarly, we are extremely happy with the presence of Professor Anuradha Chenoy, former Dean, School of International Studies, JNU, India. It was an honor to listen to you, ma'am, speak on the importance of international relations. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your words of wisdom with us. Furthermore, we wish to express our deep gratitude towards Ms. Bandana Rana, Vice Chair of UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Her works in the field of diplomacy and women empowerment has always been an inspiration to us, especially to the young and aspiring women in Nepal. Thank you, ma'am, for your very informative talk on the impact of COVID-19 on gender. I'm sure everyone enjoyed listening to you as much as I did. We are also very much delighted to have Ambassador Gyan Chandra Acharya, former Foreign Secretary of Nepal and UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for LDC with us this morning. Here we would like to put on record our appreciation for his continued contribution in the field of Nepal's diplomacy and also for speaking on multilateralism, global and regional order, including the impact of COVID-19 on LDCs. Similarly, we are humbled by the presence of Professor Amitabh Mattoo, Professor at JNU and Honorary Professor at University of Melbourne. It was great to listen Professor Mattoo share his ideas and analysis on the post-COVID-19 world order. Thank you, sir, for such a convincing presentation. Sincere thank also goes to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for his valuable inputs in organizing the summit and also to agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. We would also like to acknowledge our gratitude towards our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, and media, and different organizations. An event like this cannot happen overnight, and we have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very motivated and dedicated staff here at NIICE, the interns and volunteers. Without the untiring efforts, this event wouldn't have been possible. I cannot thank everyone enough for their involvement and their willingness. I would also like to take this opportunity to place on record our sincere thanks to each and every scholars who had applied for the summit. Although we had initially intended for a one-day event, however, upon receiving such an overwhelming response from almost 400 applicants from around 25 different countries, we had to turn this into a 3-day summit, and we're so glad that we did. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our Zoom audience and those who are watching us live on our YouTube channel. For your valuable time and attention, we hope you keep supporting us in the future as well. We are truly honored to have you all with us this morning and hope to stay connected with you in the future as well. It's really been a pleasure. We have 29 sessions lined up for 3 days, and we invite you to please join and support us there as well. Also, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, NIICE Nepal. You can also follow us on Twitter and tweet about our event using the hashtag IYSS2020. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you very much.